What's up, everybody? It's Jason Wojo. I'm your host for the Lifeonaire Show, where we help you make more, work less, create a life and business you love. I am here with my cohort, co-host, best buddy, partner in crime, Polish Peter. What's up, buddy?
Keep going. What else?
That's the only good one. Everything else was negative. Those are the only positive ones I have.
Best person I ever know. Keep going. We can go on for hours with this, man. Holy.
Yeah, that'll be a whole other podcast episode. We can just talk about that. Well, listen,
let's just shoot a podcast just on that. How about that? I think it's a great idea. Listeners, tune in, send a voicemail or email to Wojo and tell them, yes, do that. Right.
Well, listen, man, I am super excited for today's episode. We have Jason Hewlett on. I first got exposed to Jason through the NSA. I was at a National Speakers Association, and not NSA like government security. I don't want the podcast to get flagged. And so Jason's just this really talented guy, and I've always just been drawn to his. He's just a guy who likes to help people. He's a phenomenal performer. And just a really motivational guy. And he just recently came out with this book called The Promise to the One. And he has a short little video chapter on his Facebook page. And by the way, I think everybody should check it out. And I'm like, I have to get him on the podcast because he talks about this promise that we make to ourselves, or we don't make to ourselves, and how that thing can dramatically impact like every part of our lives.
Yeah, I am really excited for you guys to listen to this episode because there are so many cool things in here. We had some laughs. And if you are listening to this typically on audio, I would highly encourage you to go watch it on the video. Yeah. Because he does some really cool things on the video. You see towards the end of the episode, I was like, my jaw was almost on the floor looking at him doing stuff. So it's amazing. And actually the message, it's powerful because we all do this. We'll all do this. Yep. And then when you actually take on the promise to yourself, you'll see your life change like you've never seen before. Yeah. So I think it's really cool.
Man, let's dive in right now. Here's our interview with Jason Hewlett. Hey, Jason, welcome to the Lifeonaire Show. Thank you so much for joining us, man. I'm really excited to have you here.
So awesome to be with you. I love this show. Very cool to be a part of it.
Hey, man. Well, hey, tell all your friends and family, right?
I will.
So, man, I tell you, I've been seeing a lot of you around Facebook lately, and everything I'm seeing, man, I'm just like, I'm blown away at what you're doing. And in particular, the thing that caught my attention is you have this brand new book that literally the hard copy just came out last week. Now you've had the ebook out for a little bit, but you're really launching that and the Audible version of this. And the book is called The Promise to the One. And you did something really cool on Facebook. I want you to tell oh, sweet, man. Yeah. If you guys are watching us on YouTube right now, Jason just popped up an image of the book, so you make sure you get the right one. And so tell us, like, first of all, I'm curious, what was the motivation behind this book? Like what stirred within you that you're like, I have to share this?
Cool question. So the promise is something I've been talking about for about 4 years as my all-in message. And the promise is just based around this concept that we all have a promise that we make in our life, whether it's to the boss that we work for, the company we're with, our family or our team. And then there's the promise to the one, which is usually what's left behind. And the one is you. So that's why the promise is to the one, and the one is yourself. And so how often have we broken the promise to ourselves while keeping promises to other people instead? And we're always kind of left behind. I believe that. I've seen that happen in my life. I've seen that happen with my friends and family. And so that's where it came from. It was originally, I was striving to pack 3 elements of a promise into it, which are the promise to your audience, the promise to your family, the promise to yourself. And I finally just settled on, man, I got to talk first about the promise to ourselves. And then we can build upon it, write other books. So that's why the promise to the one is what it is.
So is that the most important promise you think you can make, is the one to ourselves?
Oh, heck yeah, no question. And, you combine that promise with your belief in God, your place of purpose, your reason for being here. If some people call it a calling, I like to refer to it as that as well, that we have something that we're mission driven to do in this life. And so, yeah, that's I think it's the very most important one, and unfortunately it falls behind the most because we're keeping promises everywhere else to so many others. And what happens is then we get burnt out. We don't become a Lifeonaire. You know, we just, all of a sudden we're just like, what's happened to my life, man? This stinks. How did I get to this point? And it's like, that's the purpose of this book, keeping the promise to yourself.
So, dude, this is like so relevant. Why do people do this? Like, why do we do this to ourselves? Like, why do we, like, we'll make promises to others and we'll hold them before, like you're saying, what you're saying is totally true. Like, why do we do that? Is there some genetic wiring in us, or is this conditioning, or is this, like, have you figured that out?
We're people pleasers.
Yeah, people pleaser. That's right, Peter. I would say, you know, that I haven't really delved into the genetics of it or the DNA of the history of that. But I do know that we're constantly in this state of survival. If we go back to the beginning of time, we're constantly trying to figure out how do we survive? How do we keep up? How do we, you know, make it so that people like us and that we're agreeable and this sort of thing. And then the next thing we know, we've almost like sold out our soul to pleasing everything else and everyone. And so I think that's where it comes from. We just are so busy trying to keep up. And eventually we go, wait a minute, what about my health? What about my spirit? What about my relationships with the people I really love? Because they're there all the time, especially during a time of quarantine and pandemic that we've lived through. You know, you start to kind of get sick of everybody. And then you get sick of yourself. And then you're mad at yourself for breaking promises to yourself. And it's just a crazy cycle. So this book is really just a reminder. I mean, that's what we know as far as, you know, if we're readers of the Bible and we're readers of the good word, we know it's all about remember, remember, remember. That's it. Remember what I've promised you. Remember what you should do. Remember why you're here. And that's why the book was written.
Man, I'll tell you, yeah, this is awesome. What happens, would you say, what does somebody go through when they just repeatedly violate that promise to themselves? Like, is it just a general deterioration of, like, they start to just feel like they're not important, or they just become like, what are the consequences of continuing to do this?
Yeah, it's a slippery slope. I mean, we you know, let's say it's just a very simple thing like your health. Say you're working out, you know, you're eating pretty well, and then all of a sudden you have something happen in your business. If you're running your own business or you work a 9-to-5 job and you have to now commit even more time to the work. Now what happens is you slowly start to break those natural health promises that you made to yourself, you know, and then at the end of each day, you're like trying to come back to this place of like, how can I find peace again and joy and fulfillment? So then we sit down and we watch Netflix, or we just zone out, or we eat whatever. And the next thing we know, we can't wake up early enough to do our workout. And we're not eating right. We're not doing these things that we know we ought to. And our body just slowly lets itself go. And we start breaking these promises to ourselves that are so simple. A promise to ourselves doesn't have to be some huge thing like, I'm going to be perfect every day. It's just not possible. The promise is a lot about forgiveness. And so if you're sitting there in this cycle of forgetfulness or not being able to keep those promises of saying, yes, health is the first thing I wake up and I do for myself. And I spiritually connect to God and to nature, and I'm outside and I feel great. If we're not doing that, forgive yourself today and make a new promise and go do it tomorrow. And that doesn't mean to cut corners at work. That means to be more focused when you are working, to be more devoted to it. But there's a way to work way, way less hours. I know you guys talk about this. You can work way less hours if you work more focused and you're purpose driven. And so I think it all works together to make it so that we're not on this slippery slope of breaking promise over and over again. And if you are, just stop, acknowledge what you're doing, and start again. Very simple concept.
Yeah. Listen, I like what you just said here, because one of the things you said, acknowledge what you're doing. And I think one of the reasons why we don't acknowledge is, I think at the beginning, for me, like, I used to be a huge people pleaser. I mean, did I say huge? I mean, it was like huge, right? And for the longest time, I didn't even realize that I was a people pleaser. So I think, do you speak in the book on how to actually recognize that you are doing all those things? Because I think a lot of people don't even realize that they are doing that.
Yeah, great point. I think that it comes down to journaling, and that's where I really talk about the importance of writing in a journal consistently. And if you read the first and second chapters, including the introduction, I mean, I'm giving people on my website a secret page to a journal guide if you've never been a journaler. And really, the journal just allows you to say to yourself, what am I accomplishing in a day? How am I living each day? What am I doing with my life? Am I headed in the direction I want to? And really, it's just this time capsule. You could flip back in your journal to a year back and be like, oh my gosh, I haven't kept one promise to myself in a year. Even simple things like, I want to pay down the mortgage on the house. Let's just say that's your big goal for your life. And you know what? If we just make a goal, sometimes we're not going to keep it. So that's why I like to say, why set a goal when we can make a promise? So open your bank account today, go into your mortgage account, and go set up an automatic payment, even for an extra 25 or 50 bucks, a little bit extra, that it becomes a promise that you made to yourself, that it now happens automatically, pretty much without even thinking, but it's in the doing of it. And yes, in the acknowledgement of, what am I doing with my life? Can I accept that this is where I'm at? Can I forgive myself and rewrite my story? That's what the promise is.
You mentioned doing, like as in being part of this promise thing and journaling. Would you say that our promises more along the lines of, for instance, for business, you have like action-based metrics, like, hey, I made 15 calls today, and results-based metrics, like, hey, I got 5 gigs. Are promises more related to your activity or your results, or could they be either? Or have you found one to be more important than the other?
Yeah, that's cool. I would say that goals are still very important. I mean, we need to still set the goal to get to that place of promise, but a promise is more of a proclamation. So that's why I say that goals are particulars, where promises are proclamations. So what are your promise proclamations? Now, you could have the goal of saying, I'm going to do 50 sales calls in a day, and maybe you'll only hit 45 of them. Well, that's still a day to celebrate. But your promise might just be completely different. It might just be a different mindset that says, I am a successful salesperson. And that just becomes your mantra. So there are little promises that we make to ourselves to say, I'm in sales and I'm great at sales and I'm going to nail this today. These are all my goals. Here we go. So it's more of a proclamation, I think. Okay,
gotcha. Which reminds me, if you wouldn't mind sharing a couple minutes, in the first chapter of your book, and I love this concept and for any of you guys, you got to find Jason on Facebook, and maybe you have it in other places as well, where you did this, your first chapter of your book in video format, which was the coolest thing I've ever seen. And you got to see Jason do this. It's really cool. It was like probably like a 15-minute segment or something like that. But you tell this story about a promise, and the story you used was where you basically, someone, it sounds like, confronted you in a moment saying, hey, this doesn't seem like you, and so in this regard the promise was related to it sounds like the kind of person you wanted to be known as and what you wanted to do. Would you mind sharing that story briefly?
Yeah, thanks for touching on that. It's called a video book, and we've just put this together. A guy named Chuck Gallagher with Primo Productions. If you're interested in having your book made, he's now doing that for authors, which is amazing. What I did is I went into the studio with him for a couple days and his team, and I just read my book on a teleprompter, but I had to read it as if I was performing it, because it was also going to be the audio for the Audible book, which just released last week. And so what was so exciting to see the first chapter as like this edited documentary was amazing, because I'm the narrator of my book. And then to be able to have all this B-roll footage and over the top laid over it, it was like a real life documentary. It was so exciting. And so I've only seen the first chapter as well. So that's what I launched and released recently. But yeah, the story you're referring to is when I was a kid, and I was raised in a religious household, and I went to a singing camp where it was at a religious university, and I was so excited to get on the stage and show everyone how good I was. All of these other talented kids stood up and started singing like operas, and I mean they were like, "Ah," you know, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't sing like that. It was a singing contest, you know, and so I thought, well, maybe I should dance and just kind of blow them all away with my dancing. And so I handed.
Can you
my
show us an
mixtape.
example?
Yeah. And so, I handed my mixtape to the guy, and then the next thing we know, the Michael Jackson music's blaring through the sound system. This is in the 90s. And so I'm doing my, you know, and I'm doing my dancing. And I did a couple of those more infamous suggestive moves, not just the moonwalk, the signature move of Michael, but some other moves that you probably shouldn't do when you're when you're a religious boy in a religious camp, high school, at a religious school camp. And so I did these moves, and guess what, guys? Crowd goes crazy. They loved it. And it's all these religious people. And so I thought, oh, they like it. I'll do it again. You know, and you're not supposed to do that, you know. You're not supposed to do that. And so, but they were cheering. And so it was like my first big stage moment. I had done this dance other places, like in the street corner where I grew up. But this was like on a stage with lights and people screaming. And when I was done, people stood up, standing ovation. I mean, I didn't just finish by, you know, saying thank you. You know, I was like, I did a spin, I ripped off my shirt, fell to my knees. Ah! You know, it was full on, just over the top. And I knew I had just completely destroyed the place with the crowd was crazy about it. And I figured, I won the talent contest that's tomorrow night. This was just the audition to see who gets to be in it for all the parents. And so I go off stage after people are high-fiving me, and there's the camp director standing there with his arms folded, a scowl on his face. And I'm waiting for my high five, like, hey, man, what'd you think, you know? And he looked at me and he said, young man, that was completely unacceptable for this stage. That was an unacceptable for what you've been raised to know to be. You're disqualified from this contest. And I would strongly advise you to consider the kind of performer you're going to be from now on. And now I was devastated. He disqualified me in my moment of glory, you know? And I went back to the dorm where I sat there as a sweaty kid with my ripped Michael Jackson shirt and my fedora and my sequin glove. And I'm looking in the window. It was at night. I'm looking at the reflection of myself and I'm thinking, that guy is such a jerk. What does he know about me? And the next thing I know, I'm thinking more like, actually, maybe he does know better. Maybe he is right. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. Maybe I do need to be on the Lord's side or I'll be on the wrong side. And it was in that moment as a kid that I made the choice to say, I'm only going to do music, comedy, stories, anything that's appropriate for families together in a G-rated fashion, if you will. So that's always family friendly. And in that moment, that kind of began my promise to become what I've become as a performer. Is what I'm known as the family friendly, you can bring your grandkids with you and no one will be embarrassed kind of a performer, and as well as a speaker and author. That's the story. I appreciate you asking.
I that left such an impact with me when you read that in the video story. But also, what I want to point out here for our listeners is that moment sounds like it stuck. That was a promise you made, and then years and years later, you talk about your potential career in Vegas, of like where you were promised basically celebrity status, and you knew this was something that it was just, I mean, you had a real choice here. Like here's where I stand in the promise I made to myself, but here's this very, I mean, I guess maybe it was an easy decision for you. Maybe you struggled with it or agonized over it. But for some people, the allure of that fame and the money and the celebrity status could be really seductive. And so you had that choice to make as well. And so this wasn't just a talent show. This is your livelihood. I mean, you had a family and all these things. Like, tell us about what that was like.
Yeah, maybe I don't play it up as much in the book as I could have. This was an agonizing decision, to be candid. I mean, we were living in my grandma's house we were renting. I mean, my wife and I trying to figure out where am I going to get the next gig for a couple $100. I mean, that's the place I was at. This was 2004. But this also came down to this spot where my wife and I were looking at this contract, and it did say, hey, you're going to be next. You're the next big thing in Vegas. All you're going to do is go around to a couple different casinos in different states, test out your material. We're going to write it for you, manage your career. We're going to take you to the next level. You'll be on billboards, on taxis, you'll be famous. And I'm like, yeah, man, this is what it's about. And as we got further into the contract, it sounded like, well, wait a minute, who's going to write the material? And the more I learned about who it was and what it was, they were expecting a different kind of promise for their audience than I had promised myself that I would keep for my audience. And so their audience was expecting the new Vegas slogan of 2003, which was, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. It was completely the opposite of the family-friendly 90s Vegas thing that they were doing. And that's what I was wanting. I wanted to be that Vegas guy, but Vegas shifted, did their own thing, and the casinos were going the same direction. And there was no compromise on the part of the casino. There was no way. And I understand that. They couldn't have compromised that, but I couldn't compromise either. And I didn't even realize that this was a big deal, you guys, until a couple of years ago when I was working with a speech coach. And she just kept harping on me saying, why is it so important to you that all of your material is clean? Why is it so important to you that your material is family friendly? And, it's kind of spiritually based. And I said, well, haven't I told you this story about this casino thing? And she flipped out when she heard the story. She goes, you have to tell that story all the time. And I had just kind of put it in a drawer. I just forgot about it because it was like, we shut that down and we said, we're not going to do the Vegas thing. We're just going to move forward. I'm just going to go speak at schools and perform for carnivals if I have to. And the next thing I know, corporations started having me. And then my life just went on. But it took a speech coach to say, wait a minute, this story's crazy. Are you serious? You turned that down? I said, yeah, I kind of just forgot about it. And so to me, that's where it was a true promise that was made long time ago in my youth when the coach or the director of that talent show, he was like, hey, you know what? Just because the audience is clapping and is excited to see that doesn't mean you should do it. And that changed the way that I saw the way that I was going to perform from then on. And it made every choice simple from then on in my life. So I didn't have to decide when casino offers on the table. When your audience is listening or watching this and thinking to themselves, well, what if I do get that promotion? What if it does take me away from my family more? At least I can provide more money. Well, then you have to consider the consequences. Do you have still a wonderful relationship with your children? Or are you going to be gone too much? Are you giving too much away of your time and your talents just to make a couple extra bucks? It's not worth it. Make a promise and keep it.
Wow, that's really good. Well, one thing that just came up for me as you were talking is, sounds to me like we make promises to ourselves a lot, actually all the time. But for you, it was when you were a kid. That was one of the promises, right? And the other aspect of it is that promises that we sometimes make are probably not so good, right? And promises that are so good. Can you elaborate a little bit about that? Because I feel like the book is about making a promise to yourself, like we have to do it, right? But I think there's also the aspect of we actually do it all the time. Not all the time, but actually do it, right?
I do believe we make a lot of promises to ourselves, and that's where a philosopher named Nietzsche said, hey, the biggest problem with making a promise is remembering that you made the promise. And so that's why we break them so much. Whether it's, hey, I promised to pick you up at 4:00 after soccer practice and you forget, or whatever the promise might be. And so consider to yourself what promises you've made. And some of them you might need to change. I mean, if you're somebody who needs to sleep 9 hours a night, then don't try to prescribe to yourself this concept of, I have to wake up before 5 a.m. because I read it in a book somewhere. That's going to damage your heart and your health. So maybe you can make a new promise, whether it's I'm going to bed earlier, I'm changing a few things in my life so that I can make it happen, so that I can get up and full night's sleep. Little promises that we break to ourselves all the time. And I know I still do it, and that's why I wrote the book. I say in the book how many promises I have broken that are so embarrassing. And at the same time, it's just a matter of forgiving ourselves and starting again. And it can be little promises or one huge one. And I take people through a process called Identify, Clarify, Magnify, which is how do you identify your promises? How do you magnify them in your life? And really, when you clarify them with somebody else, it makes all the difference in your life to go through this ICM process and say, what are my absolute promises I'm going to keep every time? Because I don't want to keep breaking them all the time to myself. Really having the accountability partner, like, for example, if I said to my children, hey guys, make sure daddy doesn't drink that kind of drink every night before bed. You know, that's my new promise to myself because I'm motivated not to have that drink before bed. Then the next thing I know, my kids are keeping me accountable because that's what kids do really, really well, right? But it just depends on what kind of promises you're willing to share with your family. Some people listening are like, I am never going to do that. But that's a real thing that really works. And so it just depends on your willingness and accountability.
Right, right. Well, man, I'm totally with you there. And as you're speaking, two things struck me. The first one is that when you're telling the story from the talent show all the way to Vegas, the promise you made was an internal promise based on who you want to be, almost an identity characteristic, like a character trait. And that character trait, who you decided you were going to be, dictated what actions were acceptable and not acceptable. And so that seems like a really powerful decision, is that someone, for whatever it is you stand for or whoever stands for, as long as you choose that, and then your actions are in alignment with that, now you've kind of set yourself up to be consistent. And, I wonder for business owners or entrepreneurs, there's so many opportunities to fall by the wayside with this. Do you want to be somebody who's making money through ill will or through dishonesty or through, or how about your business partners? If they're a little unscrupulous, do you want to be associated with that? There's so many applications here in the decisions we make and the actions we take, that if you go back to the promise that you make to yourself as to who you want to be known as, and maybe it's not even who you want to be known as, meaning there's an external reference, but maybe it's who you want to be for yourself, so that you can look at yourself in the mirror, and it doesn't matter what other people say, that you yourself have made a promise to yourself. And that's the ultimate form of integrity, is when you keep that word to yourself. And you've kind of touched on that, right? And so that is the most important of all promises, it seems. And so that seems like it's really, really important. And especially when it comes to character traits. And so I really like that. Anything you want to add to that, by the way?
Yeah, I like what you said there. That's really well said. And I've received some really cool responses from people who have read even just the first chapter or listened to the audible of it. And they send me a message almost as if they've been weeping. And they're like, my goodness, I didn't realize how important my character is to me until I listened or read that chapter. And I had one friend who's very, very well known for a viral post he made about being a dad, and he's a great guy. And he had promised one of his clients that he would come help him with this building of a fence. And he didn't know why he had made that promise. He just was like, he said he would do it because the guy kept, insisting, hey, I need your help. I need you to come help me finish this. And he's like, okay, I will. And then he had to then drive an hour there, do the work, drive an hour back. He knew it would take up his whole night. All of a sudden his son calls him and says, hey, Dad, you want to go, hang out tonight? And this guy was like, yes, I want to hang out with my son way more than do this, this job that I'm already done with. I don't need to go help this guy for real. And that's when he'd listened to the chapter of the character, the first one. And he was like, wait a minute. Of course I want to be with my son. That's a promise I've made to myself always, is to be a family man, to be a great dad, to be there for him. But I could have easily called my client and said, hey, you know what? Something came up. I can't make it. We'll try it another time or whatever. He said, what kind of character do I have that I was even questioning that? I had already made the promise to my client. And yes, it was to turn down something even better with my son. But I kept the promise. I went and I did the work cheerfully, joyfully, thankfully for a client that had helped me in the past. I'm helping him with his fence. It made me feel all the better about myself. I mean, really, that's what the promise to the one as a book is for, is to make you feel I am keeping promises that I have made and I feel better about myself, whether anyone knows the internal turmoil or not. That's what it's about.
Gotcha. Do you think, is there any kind of, and this could be different for everyone, but I'm wondering, is there any, you kind of alluded to your earlier, like perhaps the most important promise is the one we can keep to ourselves, or if you're spiritual, it can be to your creator. Is there any kind of hierarchy that you feel like is inherent in this promise thing? Like, so family should come before a friend, for instance, or is that totally individual?
Yeah, I believe it's individual to the person reading. I wouldn't want to prescribe anything, but I can say that, you would imagine that your promise to self and to creator would have to be up in the top tier, I would imagine, and family, perhaps country and other things like that. Obviously, we have our job, we have our friends, we have the community. I mean, there's so many that are involved here. I don't know if it needs to be so much hierarchical as it needs to be all-encompassing, so that we never really have any kind of question as to whether we're, keeping a promise to somebody or not. We're just making a promise and keeping it at all times.
And then when it comes to promises with other people, perhaps one step that we need to consider is like, can we keep this promise, number one, and also number two, is this in conflict with the promise that I've already made to myself or someone else? How many of us like overpromise, right? And we want to help. It's not coming from a bad area. Sometimes it's coming from a good area, but we just overcommit, and now we end up letting someone down, whether it's us or those other people.
That's right. Yeah. And so now it comes down to the question of, have you identified what your real promises are for yourself? If you're just saying yes to everything and everyone at all times. For example, Jason, when you contacted me about doing this podcast, I was like, oh man, I got the lunch and I'm rushing around. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. I do have that day open, and I'm not going to be cramming it in with a bunch of other stuff. I can devote that time to him. Whereas in the past, I may have said, hey, you know what? Maybe we can push it to another month. But I said, I got this. We can do this. Let's make it work. I think we just overschedule, overcommit, Zoom our eyeballs till they're completely fried out. Why not create a little space for ourselves, make our lives a little happier?
And knowing that you were interviewing with Jason, you still decided to take on this interview, huh? You're still like, okay, yeah, fine. Yeah.
That's good times.
Yeah. Listen, so I got a quick question, because I feel like, every single one of us has at least one book in us, right? And I think, you being an author, can probably relate to that. Why is it the book about a promise? Why that book and not some other book?
Oh, cool question. I've written other books. Nobody knows about them.
Oh, okay.
I've written, actually, the second chapter of The Promise to the One is essentially a compilation of the other two books I've written, which were both based around a concept called signature moves, which is the thing that like you're Jackson known for. Yeah, like Michael Jackson's moonwalk, that's what he was known for. Or if you think about the brand of like, Apple is simplicity and technology, that kind of thing. So what is your signature move? That was the original books that I have written. I've written 2 versions of it. And this is the first published book that I have done. And I'm very grateful to my publisher, Sound Wisdom. They're awesome. But as far as like coming up with the book and saying why the promise, I mean, you guys, I spent 20 years both as an entertainer, as a speaker, as an MC, as a writer, as a blogger, as somebody who's doing tons of podcasts. And I realized that I was just spreading great joy, which is my promise, actually. My promise proclamation is to spread joy. That's what it is. It's very simple. But I want to spread joy on my texts and my phone calls and my interviews, everywhere I can. But when it came down to what is my absolute message, I was leaning towards the commitment of joy. I did that for years. What's your commitment to joy? And let me tell you, people just weren't connecting the dots with this message. And so with coaching and with lots of people helping me, peers and others, they said, hey, you know what? We finally funneled it down from goals, commitments to this thing called the promise. And they were like, dude, you're the promise guy. Look at all the things you've done in your life. You could totally teach about keeping promises. And I was very hesitant at first. But as I started to write the stories, I realized, hey, you know what? This is a concept everybody needs. I love this idea. I mean, there's plenty of books on goals. There's plenty of books on commitment. What about this thing about a promise? There's tons about promise, but let's do something that really works for the business person, works for families, works for ourselves. And that's how it came to be. Thanks for asking, Peter.
Man, and I think the promise really supersedes all of the other ones, right? Like that's the most important. If you're looking, this is the pinnacle, this is the apex of all these other things, and so I love it. And speaking of which, Peter, when I saw Jason perform, and teach at our National Speakers Association chapter, Jason, I would love to have you on another future episode because Peter, this guy is so talented. He's just sitting here talking with us now, but you should see the things this guy can do with his voice, with his body, with inspiring people, and it's and I know that. Jason, you have a journey with that as well, and finding out the things that were unique about you that other people couldn't do, and you embraced that and went with it. I think that's a whole other message that I want to cover in another podcast. When it comes to the promise, though, you said your promise proclamation. Do you actually write this down, or do you reflect on it as like a screensaver? Do you remind yourself like what kind of things do you do, or do you just like meditate on it every day? Like what do you do to kind of reinforce that?
That's a cool question as well. I don't have it written down necessarily anywhere that I can remember. I think I came through this process over the last 2 decades and finally realized I'm just a joy spreader. That's my thing. And so that's just become my mantra, I guess. And so even when it comes to like getting an annoying email from a client or even yesterday, I got kind of an insulting email from a potential buyer of the book who was asking how much of your faith is being promoted in this spiritual book. I don't know if I don't agree with your faith, or whatever. And I just I had to then say to myself, am I going to attack this person? Do I actually care that this stranger's after me, or can I still spread joy, which is my responsibility, it's my purpose? Can I still spread joy in an email response? And yes, I did. And one of the ways that I keep myself accountable to that is I like to blind copy certain people on the response. For example, I might blind copy my wife, or on this one, I blind copied the publisher so that I could say to him, hey, guess what? You should read what I just got. Here's my response in case we get any more like this. And my publisher flipped out this morning when he responded. He said, this is the best response ever. Thank you for sharing it with me. Because the back and forth with this kind of disgruntled possible customer turned into this wonderful thing where now they're saying they're going to go buy the book. They're going to share it with their friends. They haven't even looked at it yet. But that's part of keeping the promise. So I guess when you ask, I just kind of think about it all the time and it just becomes a part of you. But that doesn't mean I don't revisit it often. Right. I go through that ICM process a lot. Identify, clarify, magnify. That's how I'm able to even do a Zoom call where it works in my office today. I wasn't able to do this 6 months ago before the pandemic hit. I would just do a really bad looking webcam. Now I have a nice camera. I have other cameras. Are we on video as well? Is this like
yeah, this is going to be on YouTube. So
right on. So
yeah,
I
it's
can show you
worldwide.
that I have
what just happened? What just happened?
Different cool camera angles. You know, like I
man.
can show you some of my faces that you were talking about, but like this is all about keeping a promise, right?
Dude,
for myself.
Why didn't we start this interview with that?
Because this makes it so that I'm standing. See, this allows me to sit. The problem is that I'm not sure how badly I've hurt my back, but I've been on my back for 2 weeks. I hurt myself hiking 2 weeks ago. So I said, I'm going to, as opposed to having this nice, beautiful angle for your show, I was like, I got to keep a promise to myself. I'm gonna use this shot today.
Yeah.
Really good looking camera, just not as good as the other one, you know?
Oh man, that's fantastic. That's awesome. Hey man, I'll tell you, this is so relevant. I want everyone to read your book. Just from the first chapter, I was hooked and just, man, it's so impactful. I think this literally has the opportunity to change people's trajectory in life. Like, it's because we have people that have been living by someone else. Someone else has had promises put on them by other people. They haven't made their own promises. They've adopted the promises of other people and the expectations of other people, and they've modeled people that perhaps it's not really what they should be doing, and like they have to do this for themselves, and they have to discover this for themselves as well. And so I'll tell you, I want to really, really thank you for sharing with our audience, man. How do people get the book, and where do they find out more about you?
Well, the book, we're trying to funnel most people to Amazon or Barnes & Noble, where they're most comfortable usually, but it's all over the place on Goodreads and BookBub and you name it. If they go to Amazon, they can find 3 options there: the paperback, the audiobook, which is Audible, or the ebook. And so I would say that the ebook doesn't give you a chance to write in the book, but it is convenient, you know, in your pocket. And then the Audible is, of course, me doing a performance. So when I say things like, and then I sing Alvin and the Chipmunks, I go, Christmas, Christmas, town is there, time for towns and time for... You know, so that kind of thing.
This is one podcast that people have to watch on video.
Yeah, you have to watch this, everyone.
Yeah.
So that's why the video book will be available eventually in some form or fashion. Okay. But the Amazon's where we're sending everybody, and then if they want to get a hold of me for speaking or doing a virtual event, I mean, as I'm just sitting here, I mean, I do tons of fun things from this space. Let me find a song we can throw on here real quick for you. This is what you were talking about earlier, Jason, that I normally do, right? This is Louis Armstrong. Come on, this is a wonderful world.
Oh, now I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? Do. They're really saying, oh yes, I love you. I hear babies cry.
All right, let's give me some applause.
Man.
That's enough.
Yeah, you got it here too. Man, dude, you're a rock star. You are a blessing. You're an inspiration. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and sharing your incredible message. And the promise you made to yourself, no doubt, is going to just create this incredible cascade of that pebble in the pond that is going to have such wide resonance with people and influence. Thanks for being on the show, man. It's been a complete pleasure.
Hey, I hope it turns out, you know, you guys have done a great podcast here, and thank you for having me on one more time. There's the book, and you guys rock. Thanks for having me on
Promise to the One, Jason Hewlett, everyone. Go get that book right now. Dude, was that awesome or what, man?
Holy cow, man. I'm going to start making my faces somehow, see if I can make my faces move that way. But
you should try it right now.
Incredible. I mean, yeah, it's not happening, man. If I try to move my nose, it's like my whole face moves, everything. So, but yeah, it's incredible, man. And the message is powerful, I think. You know, making a promise to yourself, because we make them, we break them, you know, and those 3 little things that he, the little acronym that he uses.
ICM.
It's really cool. Yeah, ICM. It's really awesome for people to take on.
Well, man, so this really struck me because, like, you know, in his story, he talks about how he made a promise to himself as the kind of person he was going to be. And that's kind of that's the guiding identity that you create for yourself. Don't let other people tell you who you are. Make a promise to yourself as to who you are. Don't take actions based on the expectations of others. Take actions based on the promise you've made to yourself. And like you kind of mentioned this in the interview a little bit, like sometimes people either they break promises themselves, or they don't even realize it's a promise themselves, or they don't even realize they don't even have a promise. Like they've never even made one themselves. They've never given enough thought to this. And as a result, we kind of talk about this a little bit in Lifeonaire. You kind of just end up doing little this, little that, a lot of nothing that's in your own best interest. It's not getting you further along the path you want to go on. And so that this whole concept of promise, I'm just fascinated by it. And I feel like it's so, so powerful.
Yeah, and if you really think about like the story that he shared about when he was performing at that camp, I mean, it is one of the most powerful promises I think that he made for himself. Yeah. That in some shape or form had tremendous impact on his life. Right. And when we look at that and actually get present to it, acknowledge and and all that kind of stuff, we start taking charge of our life. We start moving forward and actually be able to live a more powerful, impactful life. Because think about it this way. If you make a promise to yourself and you keep it, that is going to, and I saw he has kids in the background there. There's a picture of him with the kids. Yeah. I'm sure that has a much bigger impact on just him, his family, and everybody around him.
Well, so dude, that's a huge point, because like your promise affects other people, right? It's not just you. The other thing that kind of reminded me here of, and you kind of alluded to it as well, is like this promise keeping pattern shows up for you, and it probably is kind of like a snowball. So the more promises you break to yourself, the probably less like you're just gonna be like, if you would wake up one day and say, I'm gonna wake up every day at 7 and go to the gym, and then Monday comes, you push snooze, and you got to go to work, and Tuesday you roll over, and Wednesday, and eventually you kind of lose the confidence in yourself, and you start to lose your sense of self-worth, and all kinds of negative things can come as a result of that. And so similarly, if you start keeping promises to yourself, like the self-confidence, the ability for you to say no to people, and yes to other things, depending on your version of what the thing is, it just builds your character. It builds you as a person. It builds your sense of integrity. It builds, just so much worth in you, in yourself, that I think you got to be really cognizant of this, because it's so easy to not take seriously. Like, and you talk about this a lot, like with small micro commitments and promises. Like you break these things. Well, guess what? There's probably other places in your life that you're breaking these promises as well.
Right, and it impacts your life like you would never, you wouldn't recognize it unless you actually look at it. So
it's a slippery slope.
Yeah, it is a slippery slope. So go read that book. I think
The Promise to the One, Jason Hewlett. Highly recommend it. And actually, in fact, Peter, this is the first book recommendation we've ever done in the Lifeonaire podcast. So I would encourage you to check it out.
Outside of Lifeonaire book.
Outside of Lifeonaire. Right. So go check out the book. If you've enjoyed this episode with Jason and you want to get more, of course, we're here every week, but we would love to have a review from you. Let us know what you think. Go leave us a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, if you want to be part of the Lifeonaire connection, part of the Lifeonaire community, go on and download the Lifeonaire app. Maybe we'll even start a discussion about the promise in the app. And that is simply, you can get that wherever you download your apps, or you can get the desktop version over at lifeonaire.com. And once again, thank you for listening to the Lifeonaire Show, where we help you earn more, work less, create a life and business you love. And we just want you to live with complete freedom and with the promise that you've made to yourself. We'll see you next week, everyone.